Okay, so I couldn't afford to license the whole song, but that doesn't stop us talking about it. So let's start in 1949, where, despite being predicted to lose to the extent that newspapers about his defeat were printed before the results, Truman was elected as US president. He had a very busy political career, including the first use of nuclear weapons, the Berlin airlift, founding NATO, starting the arms race, ingraining anti-communist attitudes into American foreign policy, and generally poking the East and making the Cold War a whole lot worse. Although he did increase minimum wage for Americans and begin social security reforms, so that's something, I guess. Moving on, actress and singer Doris Day starred in My Dream Is Yours and It's a Great Feeling. And in Asia, following the victory of the Communist Party of China in the long and brutal Chinese Civil War, the People's Republic of China was established. Luckily, despite all the communism, Truman got on really well with them. Back to music. Quoted as a pioneering figure in rock and roll, though not widely remembered today, Johnnie Ray was a partially deaf musician who quickly became a star with cheerful releases such as Cry and The Little White Cloud That Cried, and was remembered by other such musicians as Billy Joel and Dexy's Midnight Runners. Also in this year, in theatre, South Pacific, a widely popular play and later movie, tackled pretty bold themes for the 40s such as racism, sex, and gender roles. Meanwhile in the media, Walter Winchell, a columnist holding the coveted title of Inventor of the Gossip Column, along with fellow columnist Drew Pearson, exposed a shocking government conspiracy resulting in the Secretary of Defense getting sacked. And Joe DiMaggio, a player for the New York Yankees, was the first baseballer to be valued at over $100,000 or $1 million today, and he still holds the famous record for a 56-game hitting streak. Moving on to the 50s, and US Senator Joe McCarthy was hunting for communists through the means of blacklisting and character assassinations. His name even became a term to describe the act of accusing people for treason without proper evidence. And his acts of McCarthyism were also being aided by one Richard Nixon, who used McCarthyism as a way to boost his career by being at the center of a trial around suspected spy Alger Hiss. Soon after Hiss's conviction in 1950, Nixon was actually elected to become a senator, so I guess his plan worked pretty well. Also at this time, Studebaker, an American car company with a terrific generic 50s motif, failed to meet Ford's post-war competition and began the slow descent towards bankruptcy. And speaking of things that are nearly dead, television! And although you may be streaming this on your pocket supercomputer whilst ignoring your emails because some complex computer algorithm brought it to your attention, in 1950, none of those things existed, and the only convenient screen to numb your brain had a maximum of 4 monochrome channels and sometimes emitted dangerous amounts of radiation. But hey, it was the only option, so they became quite popular anyway. Meanwhile, back in Asia, there was a war, the Korean War, where the Soviet and Chinese back north invaded the US and UN back south. Now, you may know who this is, and you may even have seen 1 or 2 pictures of her before, and that's because in the 50s, Marilyn Monroe transitioned from playing minor roles in films to becoming one of the biggest stars in America. Moving on to 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were the first 2 US citizens in American history to be tried and executed for espionage, accused of selling atom bomb secrets to the Soviets by Ethel's younger brother. Their case wasn't helped by, regardless of how, the Soviet Union developing their own atomic bomb in 1949. And that just wouldn't do. So in the classic mine's bigger than yours move, the US began development of the hydrogen bomb, a bomb so needlessly more powerful than its predecessor that it needed an original atomic explosion just to trigger the new one. In boxing, which you better get used to because we'll be coming back to it a lot, Sugar Ray Robinson, regarded as one of the greatest boxers of all time, was named Fighter of the Year in both 1942 and, as alluded to here, 1951. Briefly back across to Asia, the small village of Panmunjom began hosting peace talks from 1951 to 1953, resulting in, even after wild border movements and over 2.5 million deaths, a ceasefire being called basically where it all started, with peace officially being declared in 2018. Panmunjom now hosts the Inter-Korean Peace House, which is where the 2 nations still meet for peace talks. Also in 1951, actor and heartthrob Marlon Brando rose to fame with his Academy Award-nominated performance in A Streetcar Named Desire, and The King and I had its opening night on Broadway, receiving critical acclaim. Although, it wasn't a very controversial piece, unlike The Catcher in the Rye, a book which many still cite today as one of the great publications of the 20th century. As mentioned, the book had its fair share of controversy, as it became one of the most censored books in the United States. In 1952, Eisenhower succeeded Truman, voted in off the back of his successful career fighting Nazis and leading NATO. Meanwhile, after over a decade of increasing polio cases in the US, a vaccine developed by Jonas Salk was tested and later widely rolled out across the world, reducing annual US cases from almost 60,000 in 1952 to less than 1,000 only 10 years later. And over in the UK, following the death of King George VI, Princess Elizabeth Windsor became Queen Elizabeth II. The fact that this is still the case makes her the longest reigning monarch in world history. Back to boxing, and Rocky Marciano became the world heavyweight champion. Meanwhile, Liberace, the besparkled and flamboyant piano player, was becoming a driving force in entertainment, at one point being the highest paid entertainer in the world. Though, whilst Liberace was rising, philosopher George Santayana, famous for sayings such as "those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," died. Moving forward, and the death of Stalin in 1953 shook the whole world, leaving both a power vacuum in the Soviet Union and an unknown future for its relations with other nations. Over 100 people died in the crushing crowds at his funeral, and, despite there being no appointed successor, one man became the new premier, and that was Malenkov. Now, Malenkov wasn't officially the new party leader because there was no leader of the Communist Party. No, really, there was no official title for being the head of the party, and so technically there wasn't one, even though there was, and it totally used to be Stalin. But anyway, Malenkov's name was written first in the list of new committee members, so the age-old tradition of "I'm first" made him in charge, though his position was to last just 6 months, and these weren't the only power shifts in 53. Over in Egypt, Gamal Nasser started the year as Secretary General of the Liberation Rally, but by early 1954 had removed the monarchy, banned all other political parties, and had taken control from former Prime Minister Mohammad Naguib. He would go on to become one of the most influential leaders in modern Arab history until he died in office in 1970. Whilst also in 1953, famous Russian composer, pianist, and conductor Sergei Prokofiev died. In American news, Winthrop Rockefeller, grandson of oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, was the subject of a high-profile divorce. Meanwhile, Winthrop's brother Nelson was being appointed as special assistant to the president for foreign affairs. And in baseball, Roy Campanella was a catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Regarded as being one of the greatest catchers ever, he was labeled as the most valuable player on the national level 3 times. Now, in case you forgot that communism was still a thing, here's a handy map which shows the Communist Bloc, which were the eastern countries which were, surprisingly, communist, who were in opposition to the western capitalist bloc for the duration of the Cold War. Moving on to 1954, and Roy Cohn, a prominent lawyer who chiefly assisted Joe McCarthy's investigations, abandoned McCarthy's staff. Meanwhile, Argentinian President Juan Peron began to lose his grip on power, leading to an initial coup attempt by the Argentine Navy, which killed at least 320 civilians, and a second successful coup attempt by the Army and Navy 3 months later. In April of 1954, at Carnegie Hall, the world-famous conductor Arturo Toscanini performed for the last time. After a lapse in his concentration led him to a stoppage of 14 seconds, he never conducted live again. Concentration can be unreliable, but you know what's always reliable? Dacron, a new and futuristic material. Dacron was used to make what is better known today as standard polyester clothing, which was considered a miracle of its time for its long life and crease resistance. Though, Dacron eventually came to be considered cheap and tacky, and went from lining the outsides of people to the insides of fish. Back to Asia, and Dien Bien Phu fell. This city in modern-day Vietnam was the last French stronghold in the area, and their loss of control led to the creation of separate, temporary, North and South Vietnamese nations. And whilst this split was temporary, their reunification was far less than harmonious. Anyway, remember rock and roll? Well, Rock Around the Clock dragged it into the global mainstream media, particularly acting as an anthem for rebellious 50s teens after its use in the movie Blackboard Jungle. Moving on to 1955, and arguably the most famous physicist in history and creator of the most recognizable equation ever, Albert Einstein, died, as did James Dean, a teen icon famous for his role in Rebel Without Cause, being killed in a car accident, starring in Giant, and then being nominated for 2 Academy Awards for Best Actor, all in that order. Baseball again, and after decades of the catchphrase "wait till next year," the Brooklyn Dodgers finally won the World Series and earned their catcher his 3rd MVP. Now, what's on TV? It's Davy Crockett, a 5-part miniseries depicting the adventures of frontiersman Davy Crockett. This show is also responsible for the stereotype of 50s kids wearing coonskin hats, and, despite its popularity, the show would not be repeated on TV until the 1960s.
Yeah, well, I saw it on a rerun.
What's a rerun?
You'll find out.
Speaking of TV that year, the 1954 Broadway adaptation of Peter Pan made history, being the first Broadway production to ever be broadcast as a TV movie, in full colour no less. Not leaving out music, 1955 was a big year for a small-time singer you may have heard of called Elvis. Elvis Presley was a simple truck driver from America, but he went from releasing his first single in 1954 to having his first #1 single, #1 album, record deal, and movie deal by 1956, eventually becoming one of the most popular singers ever. Something else which you may have heard of is Disneyland, which opened its gates for the first time in 1955, and although the opening day was nothing short of a disaster, the park went on to become the monstrous chain we know it as today. Someone else who was incredibly popular around this time, though was somewhat less child-friendly, was 50s sex icon Brigitte Bardot. 1956 saw Bardot's career explode as she featured in 4 hit movies which solidified her international fame. Now, not forgetting the lingering communism, the Hungarian Revolution started in 1956. Naturally, the Soviets decided to respect their choices and... oh wait, no they didn't. They invaded and brutally suppressed it. Secret police fired at protesters in Budapest, whilst soldiers ripped off their red stars and joined the crowds, leading to Soviet soldiers and tanks being sent in as backup. Some called this the first crack in the Iron Curtain. Meanwhile, in Alabama, after refusing to give up her seat on a bus, Rosa Parks' actions started a series of protests which led to the US Supreme Court ordering an end to racial segregation on transport, kickstarting the civil rights movement. Now, remember Malenkov, leader of the Soviet Union? Yeah, not anymore. He was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who, in 1956, gave a secret speech in which he denounced Stalin and encouraged reform. These words gave hope to the eastern countries such as Poland and Hungary, who were inspired to revolt for change, and these revolutions were, as previously mentioned, crushed. And finally, 1956 also saw the actress Grace Kelly become a princess when she married Prince Rainier III of Monaco. The book Peyton Place was released, touching on themes of sex, social inequality, and class privilege, and there was trouble in the Suez. Remember how Nasser took over Egypt? Well, he nationalised the canal area, leading to a joint British, French, and Israeli invasion in response, though they were humiliatingly forced to withdraw, signalling the very end of Britain and France's roles as the global superpowers.